Thank you, Whitney. And thank you so much, Dr. T, for that powerful reading. I think what you've shown us in that reading is that people's lives are really affected by housing discrimination, what's going on. And so I'm going to talk about a pilot that I'm the project director of called Homes for Equity, and how we're trying to redress the impact of housing discrimination on families and individuals' real lives. So if you allow me, I'll share my screen and we'll go through a quick presentation. And then Dr. Neenah is going to talk with you about the research that she and her team conducted for the Homes for Equity initiative. All right. So Homes for Equity is a pilot to build wealth through home ownership for people of color who've experienced housing discrimination. Our goal is to start to make a small dent in the racial wealth gap. There are 3 partners of Homes for Equity. They include Opportunity Communities, Nuestra Comunidad Development Corporation, and Massachusetts Affordable Housing Alliance. So most of us know that homeownership is a way that many families in the US build economic security and create intergenerational wealth. White families have leveraged public policies like the GI Bill and FHA mortgages for decades. And yet these initiatives were not available to people of color. In fact, public policies such as redlining and urban renewal really limited what people of color could do around home buying. They included the policies started at the federal government, were then translated down to local and state governments, and in fact, private industry. So Jake is going to talk a little bit later about the appraisal industry, but all of these factors contributed to Black folks and other people of color being kept out of the home market. And that directly influenced the wealth and the intergenerational wealth of people of color. In fact, our research showed from a 2016 study that estimated that without direct intervention, it would take the average Black family 228 years and the average Latinx family 84 years to accumulate the wealth that the average white family had in 2016. To me, that's very jarring. That means that in my lifetime, in your lifetime, people of color will not catch up. And so we believe that something has to be done. And Homes for Equity is a bold and innovative initiative where we're trying to close the racial wealth gap explicitly by allowing households of color harmed by housing discrimination to buy affordable homes and to generate wealth. We intend to explicitly market affordable homes to Black people in Roxbury and to change the current affordable housing deed restrictions to allow them to more quickly realize their homes, to allow them to more quickly realize their home's equity appreciation. We'll test our theory of change by piloting the implementation of HFE with Nuestra Comunidad's Copeland Corner development project, which is at 5 Burton Street in Roxbury. So Nuestra is going to be building 12 condos in Roxbury. We're hoping that the groundbreaking takes place later this year. And we plan on putting 3 of those housing units under the Homes for Equity program. We also have 3 private developers who are building homes in Roxbury this year and over the next couple of years who have also agreed to work with us and to leverage our framework to target Black people for home ownership in Roxbury. So we've seen this map. This map was on CHAPA's opening slide. It's used quite a lot because this is the redlining map for the city of Boston. And the red area that you see is where Black folks and people of color primarily lived. And these were the areas that the Homeowners Loan Corporation, otherwise known as HOLC, created back in the 30s and 40s that really stopped Black people from being able to get mortgages and financing to buy houses. And that was really the genesis of the housing discrimination that started, in the way it started. So we have two specific components of Homes for Equity that I'm going to talk with you about. First, the legal basis of it is actually in the Fair Housing Act. And the Fair Housing Act was mentioned earlier, but people know that the Fair Housing Act prohibits discrimination on the basis of race. But what many people don't know about the Fair Housing Act is that it also establishes an obligation for us to redress or reverse those conditions of housing discrimination. We have a very significant legal analysis that was done by Henry Corman, who is one of your distinguished panelists today. Henry wrote our legal analysis that basically analyzed the extent to which fair housing and civil rights laws permit race to be considered when homeowners are members of a racial group that have experienced housing discrimination. So we plan on leveraging this obligation to be able to target and market Homes for Equity homes explicitly on the basis of race. We believe that our research that Dr. Neenah is going to talk to you about substantiates and undergirds the fact that significant race-based housing discrimination existed and in fact still continues to exist to this day. So in spite of the Fair Housing Act that was supposed to prohibit this discrimination has a history, a strong history, has been egregious, and in fact continues to exist to this day. We have two major tenets associated with Homes for Equity. The first one is to, as I just mentioned, explicitly market these homes on a race-conscious basis. Most people that know the Fair Housing Act today would say that that's illegal. But if you go back to the fact that the Fair Housing Act requires us to redress conditions of discrimination, we believe that we have a case to be made that we can do that. So we will be marketing these 3 condos that West is developing, and some of the ones that our 3 private developers are developing also in a race-conscious way, or to Black people that live in Roxbury, to be frank about it. The second piece of what we're trying to do is to change the affordable housing financing policies to allow for greater wealth building by buyers of color. And what that means is that we want to be able to change the existing deed restrictions that limit the equity appreciation. Primarily, the equity appreciation is the big determinant of people gaining wealth from their homes when they buy a subsidized affordable home. So we're currently in conversations with the city to talk about changing the deed restrictions. Our position is not at all to remove affordable homes from the market, to be clear. Our position is that there is a case for reparations and redress, and that we're asking the city to step up, given the housing discrimination that our research substantiated, and to make those homes, help to keep those homes affordable, to strike a better balance between a person that buys an affordable home being able to get more and greater wealth out of it over a shorter time frame, and for the city to use their funds to help keep that home affordable for the future. So just to talk real quickly about the 2 main sections of HFE. So we all know proxies have been used historically to target certain people for home ownership. And what we're proposing is to go from broad proxies all the way over to a very explicit criteria based on race. So proxies often fall short of what they're intended to do. The research has shown that in a number of cases. We believe that by explicitly targeting race, that we'll have a stronger chance of getting homes to people that have been discriminated against. And on the changes to the affordable housing finance, what we want to do is, again, and we're currently in conversations with the city to change the deed restrictions. Right now, there's limits on the equity appreciation, how much homeowners that buy affordable homes can take as far as appreciation when they sell the home. Today, the city's master covenant only allows the homeowner to take 3%, to have a gain of 3% per year. And in 2021, the equity appreciation of the average home in the Boston area was well over 9%, about 9.6% according to the research. So we want to strike a better balance of homeowners getting 3% versus 9% to help them get more equity quicker. Again, with the goal of closing the racial wealth gap and creating intergenerational wealth. There's a cap on resale prices. And so what we want to do is to reduce all of these deed restrictions so that homeowners that have suffered housing discrimination can really leverage and get redress through changes in the policies. We've recently completed 13 months of research. And again, Dr. Neenah is going to be taking it over in a minute and telling you a lot more about that. The research is available on Opportunities Community's website, and I'll put that in the chat in a minute. But what our research found is that there is, in fact, a compelling and egregious pattern of actions by entities at all levels, including the city, the state, and the federal governments, and private interests, as I mentioned earlier, those banks, realtors, and appraisers that have resulted in housing discrimination in Roxbury. We have 4 research reports that also are available on that website. We're just starting to share that data publicly. And as well as we have some information and pictures of the 9 people that we interviewed for our oral history research piece of the oral history piece of the research. So we encourage you to go to the website and take a look at that data. I'm going to turn it over. I think this is a good point to turn it over to Dr. Neenah, who led her team in doing the research. We'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Maria. I really appreciate it. Let me go ahead and something's not working. Of course, something's not working when you need it to. So just want to say real quickly as we're starting, I just want to thank Maria actually for being such a wonderful thought partner in addition to at her in this whole process. Maria had the distinct, difficult job of shepherding both the researchers and the community partners in this project. That's not an easy task, and I know because I'm a PI on a bunch of different projects. So I also need to thank my team, Dr. Nancy Lee, Dr. Marcos Luna, our interns, Darlia Bennett, Jim Di Giulio, and my assistant, Denise Villar, who a fantastic team to work with. May all the researchers here be blessed with a team with whom you can do hard things and also have fun doing it. So just so you know, this was a community-based participatory action research project, which among other things meant that we had a really fantastic community research advisory board, which included our friends Whitney and Rachel here at CHAPA and some other folks who are here in the room. So they not only supported the project by recruiting some of our oral history participants, but importantly kept our researcher tendencies in check. For the academics and the researchers in the room, I'm not going to be going into the details of method or design. If you want to talk shop, we can do that in a different venue. Because as we say in our reports, and as Dr. Tiffany set us up for this morning, the goal here is to disturb Boston's willful blindness to its own history and to provide support to act on our legal and our moral duty to redress historic and ongoing racial discrimination, particularly in the housing market. And so we did this by documenting as best we could the policies and practices of historic and ongoing racial discrimination in the homebuyer market, as well as, and with a specific focus on Roxbury, as well as the ongoing economic impacts of historic and ongoing racial discrimination. So just so you know where we're headed, I'm hoping that you leave here today understanding three things. So the first of which is that public policy is the root cause of the racial homeownership and associated racial wealth gap in Boston. What Richard Rothstein documented at the federal level is also true here in Massachusetts and in the city of Boston. Second, Boston and the state knew that Black and Latinx households and homeowners would be disproportionately affected by government actions. They knew that there was deep and widespread racial discrimination both before and after racial discrimination was explicitly illegal, and they did little and often nothing to prevent or address it. And finally, significant wealth has been extracted from Black and Latinx households and in our Black and Latinx communities in Roxbury and across Boston because of the actions and inactions of the city of Boston, Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and the federal government. I would like to start telling this story by starting with what Roxbury was like in the memories of our longtime Black residents and homeowners who participated in the oral history part of this project. Everyone who lived in Roxbury that we interviewed during the middle 20th century described a self-sustaining community. Despite all of the challenges that overt and covert racial discrimination provides, Lower Roxbury in particular was described as having everything a community would need, including social connection. It's also worth noting that in the middle 20th century, Roxbury was changing rapidly. At the time that this picture that you see here on the screen was taken at Madison Park, a park that was destroyed by urban renewal, the racial demographics of Roxbury was flipping. This is in part fed by the post-World War II second wave of the Great Migration, as well as white flight, which was itself fostered and spurred by the federal highway and housing programs that we'll discuss in a little bit. But what's important to understand in this chart, and just full disclosure, this is the one chart that you will not see in any of the reports because I just made it last week. But what's important to understand in this chart is that when the key policy decisions were being made by the city and the state in the 1950s and early 1960s, decisions that we are living with today, Roxbury was rapidly becoming the center of Black Boston that we know today. You're gonna see this a little later. It suffices to say for the moment that this blackening of Roxbury was alarming to city leaders. So where are we at today? I'd like to go back to something that Maria pointed out a little earlier. Here in Boston, we live with some of the largest racial homeownership gaps in the country. And actually, according to one BRA report that we read that was written in the late 1980s, Boston had the highest Black-white homeownership gap of any city in the country in 1980. But what I want to call your attention to is that the racial homeownership gap today for both Black and Latinx homeowners is larger than it was 40 years ago. One contributor to this gap is the extremely high rates of denial for mortgages in the neighborhoods with the largest Black and Latinx populations. When we looked at HMDA data, so this is the mortgage data that's collected by the federal government from the banks, one of the things that we found is that Black, Latinx, and Afro-Latinx applicants, people trying to buy homes in Boston, were anywhere from 35% to over 300% more likely than white applicants to be denied a mortgage. This disproportionately higher rate of denial occurred at all income levels. In fact, we found that high-income Black applicants for mortgages to buy a home were 32% more likely to be denied than low-income white applicants. And I want to be explicit about what we're seeing here. What this tells us, what this suggests, is that the racial disparities in mortgage denial is about race. It's not about income. So the question that all of this raises is, how did we get here? Right? We might be tempted to lay the blame entirely at the feet of the banks and the real estate industry, and the private sector has significant responsibility for the persistence of these disparities. But today I would like to focus on root causes. So what you see here is the redlining map that was, that we see this a lot, especially here in Boston. One of the things that I think that's important to understand is that the racial homeownership gap and the racial disparities and the discrimination that we see today did not start with this redlining map. It actually starts a little earlier with the early 1930s New Deal housing programs. Those programs were designed for local control. For those of you who are not familiar, what local control really means is that the local field offices that hire local people were explicitly authorized to make decisions on how to implement these federal programs. So what this effectively allowed is for Jim Crow norms in the South, as well as up here in the North, because we had our own Jim Crow too. Those norms determined who benefited and who didn't benefit from these federal programs. Now, that's not to say that these Folk redlining maps are unimportant. What is significant isn't so much the creation of these maps, actually. It's that Holk developed a process of assessing loan risk that was focused on entire neighborhoods, not on properties or home buyers, but on the neighborhoods, was overtly racially discriminatory and was replicated across federal agencies, specifically the Fair Housing Administration, the FHA, and the Veterans Administration, the VA, both of which are very important, especially in the implementation of the GI Bill. The other important thing to understand about how this all worked is that the process of determining where were the high-risk loan neighborhoods, that process was kind of foisted upon, but then embraced by the banks and the real estate industry. We know, for example, that Folk and the FHA, while they claim that they never shared their maps, we do know that they shared their evaluation process with the banks and encouraged them to create their own maps. And some of you who don't know this history might be asking, okay, how racially discriminatory really was it? Because it's so hard to think that it could be that bad. It was pretty explicitly racist. This is what you see here on the screen is from the FHA's 1936 Underwriter's Manual, which detailed how loan risk was to be assessed. And as you see here on the screen, evaluators were directed to examine whether there were quote unquote incompatible racial groups or a change in racial occupancy in the neighborhood. Now you might say, well, that doesn't say that Black neighborhoods are high risk. It just says that racially integrated neighborhoods are at high risk. So first, it's still really bad, and that's still pretty unacceptable. But also, the Underwriter's Manual from 1936, honestly, for decades afterwards, and the other FHA policies and practices made very clear that they did not support construction loans or home purchase loans that did not have racial deed restrictions. And I'm only showing you a small bit of the racist policies, anti-Black, anti-Latinx, anti-Asian racist policies at the FHA. When taken together, it becomes very clear that as far as the federal government is concerned, neighborhoods with Black or brown people in them are to be considered too high risk to lend in. And the FHA, just to remind you, was the primary source of financing for home construction and purchasing during this mid-20th century period. Now, this is the other thing I want to be clear about. Roxbury as a neighborhood was rated as hazardous or definitely declining, right? So red line and yellow line before it became the center of Black Boston. That redlining map was made in 1938. However, if you go back and look at that redlining map, The white neighborhoods of Boston that were rated the same way, hazardous or definitely declining, South Boston, significant parts of the Back Bay, which is considered today to be the wealthier part of Boston, they were able to shed that stigma. Roxbury and Boston's other Black and brown neighborhoods never did. So these discriminatory policies affected both Black buyers' ability to purchase a home, but it also affected white owners' ability to sell their home. We see this in the experience of one of our oral history participants who was forced into what are called contract purchase agreements. These are very risky for the buyer. Read the report, we kind of describe it there. But he was forced into these contract agreements to purchase properties because banks refused to give him a mortgage despite his ability to pay. Now, again, keep in mind, when buyers can't get a mortgage, sellers can't sell their houses. And when people can't sell their homes that they don't want or that they can't or don't want to live in anymore, those properties are now at higher risk of not being maintained, not being updated, or becoming abandoned. So where are we at? 1950s, 1960s. As Roxbury was becoming the center of Black Boston, we have banks that won't lend in Black and brown neighborhoods, even if people want to sell, because that's federal policy. We have banks that won't allow Black and brown buyers to purchase homes in white neighborhoods because that is both federal policy as well as also part of pre-existing racial bias. So by this time, we have now created the perfect conditions for producing the racial homeownership gaps that we see today and historically. Very importantly for Roxbury, however, we also created the conditions for what became known as blight. And we're going to come back to that in a minute. But before we get there, we also must talk about the city and the state's transportation policies and their role in this story. Now, I go into more detail about this in the report, but what you see here on the screen is the start of the controversial Southwest Expressway and Inner Belt Highway proposals. What you see here was this first proposal was made in 1948. This was the beginning of the blackening of Roxbury. Now that blue line that you see, that was a depressed highway, not a covered highway, not a buried highway, but a depressed highway running right through Roxbury Crossing. Transportation planners for this plan claimed that extensive takings would not be needed to build this highway, clearly ignoring the hundreds of homes and businesses just in this map that you see here on the screen. And just for those of you who aren't super familiar with this part of Roxbury or this part of Boston, if this had gone through, there would be no Roxbury Community Center, at least not where it's at now. There would be no Islamic Society Boston Cultural Center, at least where it's at now. There would be no Roxbury Heritage Park. Not even sure what would have happened to the Basilica that's right up the street from here. Now, nothing happens quickly in Boston or Massachusetts, and that includes transportation planning. There's actually kind of a funny little report from HUD criticizing Boston in the 1950s, saying, y'all are taking too long. You keep studying things to death. So in 1962, fast forward 14 years, we have state transportation planners who are still trying to get these highways built, and they are entirely fixated on building highways through Roxbury. In all the reports that we read, the state was pretty unconcerned about the displacement that these highway projects would cause. Their own reports predicted that the proposed highway projects through Roxbury and the South End would cause housing shortages. They moved forward anyways. So to paraphrase N.K. Jemisin, indifference does more damage than outright hatred. Boston saw the state's lack of concern and decided to compete for which level of government could show the most negligence towards its Black and brown residents. In 1959, the city's planning department, so this is before the BRA, the city's planning department, their transportation policy proposed to conspire with the state to align their city's urban renewal policies with the state's highway projects, not because it would be more efficient or less disruptive, but because it would save the city money. In short, the city's planning department wanted the state to take the land for highway projects, which the city supported, so that it was the state kicking people out, and then the city wouldn't be responsible for paying to relocate those families that they were already planning to displace through their urban renewal programs. Can Boston look worse than this? Yes, it can, because the city of Boston targeted Roxbury for urban renewal. And by that, I mean, if you're going to destroy a neighborhood to save the city, there were actually better candidates. The federal programs for urban renewal required that the city declare an area blighted or that the housing be substandard. Feds left it up to the states to define what blight was. The state left it up to the city. And the courts basically said, yep, you can do whatever you want. The BRA loved to say that they were using American Public Health Association standards. Those standards themselves are highly suspect. That's a whole other talk. But one of those standards that APHA proposed for determining blight was the existence of indoor plumbing. And now I think we can all agree that it's not unreasonable, even in 1960, to say that housing without indoor plumbing is probably substandard. However, if the Boston Redevelopment Authority had used or integrated that definition when deciding which neighborhood to focus urban renewal on, they would have targeted the North End. Because as you can see here on the screen, the North End had 4.5 times the number of substandard housing units than Washington Park in Roxbury did. But in 1959, the newly formed Boston Redevelopment Authority, the BRA, instead set their sights not on white Italian American North End, but on the now pretty solidly Black Roxbury. Solidly Black, mainly because Black people were almost half of the neighborhood. As with transportation policy at the state level, the Boston Redevelopment Authority openly ignored the impacts of urban renewal on Roxbury's Black and Brown residents. The BRA actually commissioned a study on the economic feasibility of the Washington Park Urban Renewal Plan, which was the first urban renewal plan that the BRA did. These two reports that you see here on the screen, and the data from these reports were used in the city's application for federal funding for the Washington Park Plan. But what Chester Rapkin made very clear in these reports was that the majority of Black residents in the Washington Park urban renewal area would not be able to afford to rent or to buy any of the proposed newly constructed housing. In addition to that, Rapkin found that the property values in Roxbury, in the Washington Park area, were too low for the homeowners to obtain financing even under existing federal programs in order to pay for the repairs and upgrading, which was the central selling point of this plan. This whole plan was supposed to be about updating people's homes and adding community assets. The city knew that homeowners wouldn't be able to afford to do this. They knew that renters would not be able to afford to stay. And I don't know why any of these people thought that any Black people were going to be able to get a loan. They knew all of this, and the city moved forward anyway. So as we know, we already got their federal monies, and between the proposed highway projects and the urban renewal projects, large parts of Roxbury began to disappear. Several of our oral history participants who survived that time described that Roxbury in the 1960s and 1970s into the early 1980s looked like a photo of London after the Blitz. This term, it looked like a bombed area, came up multiple times. Now, we're going to talk in a few minutes about the economic implications of all of this, but let's first remember that in destabilizing the neighborhood of Roxbury, the city, with the complicity of the state and the federal government, with the help of their friends in the private sector, destabilized people's lives. Several of our oral history participants described people that they knew forced into instability and then the trauma that this created. And let's just keep in mind too, the 1960s and 1970s, this was still the time of the Great Migration. Many of the most vulnerable Black families in Roxbury had already been forced to leave their homes and their communities in the South because of the violence and exploitation there. They were just beginning to find stability here, and now they were being uprooted again by the violence of a different kind of public policy. One of the things that Chester Rapkin noted as a problem that was going to prevent the success of the Washington Park Plan was widespread and well-known racial discrimination, especially in the home buying market and the mortgage market. Boston's response to that was to revive the Boston's Banks Urban Renewal Group, or BBURG. And this is something that's very unique to Boston. BBURG was a consortium of a couple of dozen banks that Mayor Kevin White revived after the 1968 uprisings, and basically forced those banks into providing FHA-insured mortgages to Black and Spanish-speaking buyers. To be clear here, these FHA-insured mortgages created zero risk for the banks, okay? But they were forced into doing it. So the banks said, fine, we'll do that, but we're only going to allow Black and Latinx buyers to purchase homes within a prescribed area. So BBURG effectively engaged in reverse redlining. So I want to zoom in on this for a little bit for you. And so that for those unfamiliar with Boston's geography, BBURG basically contained Black and Latinx home ownership to a small number of neighborhoods. And we go into more detail about this in our reports, but what's important to know now is that in addition to restricting Black and Latinx, where Black and Latinx people could buy homes, BBURG also set up the conditions for blockbusting. So blockbusting is where real estate people scare white homeowners, basically taking advantage of their internalized racism. So they scare the white homeowners into selling their homes at below market value, and then they resell those homes at prices much higher than they're worth. So that's bad because that's just basic exploitation. What's worse, however, to me, is that the city knew that this was happening and they actually refused to do anything about it. When the BRA staff raised this issue with the BRA leadership about many issues with BBURG, but also specifically the racially discriminatory aspects of this initiative, the BRA leadership basically gave them a pass. We can't oblige the banks to meet the needs of Black and brown homebuyers. Another thing that we found in the archives is that the banks basically, so the mayor's office, Mayor Kevin White's office, went to the banks and said, this doesn't look good, guys. We don't like how you're doing this. Can you expand where you're allowing people to buy, right? We've got willing sellers, but they can't get the mortgage. And the banks basically said, if you try to force us to lend beyond the BBURG line, we're going to shut the whole program down. Mayor Kevin White and his staff capitulated to this threat. And again, these policy decisions have real impacts on people's lives. Many of the homes bought through BBURG needed significant repairs or updates. We were able to interview one person who did buy their home through BBURG, who needed to have the roof repaired. It still had a septic system when she bought the home in 1972. Homeowners were forced to make the choice between doing repairs or paying an inflated mortgage note. According to one estimate, more than 50% of BBURG loans ended up in foreclosure. Now, this brings us to the question that I know a lot of you want to know. What are the economic implications of all of this, right? So we calculated the economic impacts of three things that happen. And so the first I want to share with you is related to those inflated prices that BBURG buyers paid. So without getting into the details of the method there, we were able to ascertain that somewhere between that different BBURG buyers usually paid somewhere between $3,000 to $10,000 more than what they should have paid. To put this into perspective, this is $3,000 to $10,000 in like 1970 type dollars. This amounts to $23,000 to $78,000 in today dollars. So we asked basically, given the $3,000 to $10,000 overpayment, if home buyers had or had been able to take that money, that $3,000 to $10,000 that they overpaid, put that money into a savings account in 1970, how much would they have accrued in 2021? We also asked if they could have taken that $3,000 to $10,000 and invested it in the stock market, the same amount of money, how much would have been accrued between 1970 and 2021 over those 50 years? And as much as I would love to play a game with you around, let's figure out what people think, we don't have time for that. Let's just say we use standard assumptions around the rate of accrual for savings and stock markets investment over this period of time. We also used a more conservative assumption. What we estimated is that a single household would have accrued anywhere from $8,000 to $79,000 just in a savings account over that period of time. Or if they had invested it into the stock market, it would have been anywhere from $547,000 to $1.4 million. Again, this is just one household. One household, there were hundreds of Beberg households. We did something similar with another interesting thing that we found. Roxbury residents were paying disproportionately higher tax assessments compared to white neighborhoods. This isn't interesting in so far as this happens. We know that this has happened in other cities. What's kind of maddening about it is that the city had known for decades that Boston's Black neighborhoods were paying much higher property taxes than similar or similarly valued properties in white neighborhoods, and they just couldn't figure out what to do about it. So in our second estimate of economic impacts, I'm not going to go into the details of the method, but we basically were able to estimate that if a Washington Park homeowner in Roxbury had paid the same taxes for just 1 year as a Charlestown homeowner, and Charlestown is, for those of you who don't know, Charlestown is a neighborhood of Boston. It's particularly at this time in the 1970s, a working class white neighborhood that also had its fair share of urban renewal and highway development shenanigans. We were able to estimate that for just 1 year, the Washington Park homeowner paid a little more than $700 more in their tax assessment than a similarly situated Charlestown homeowner would. So again, if the homeowner had been able to save or invest that money, that's just that $700 between 1970 and 2021, how much would have been accrued? So again, this is just 1 year's relief from disproportionate tax assessment. We estimate that in a savings account over that 50-year period, $2,000 to $5,600. If it was in the stock market, $39,000 to $100,000. And again, I want to emphasize, one household, 1 year's worth of equitable tax assessment. Imagine if this had been decades. The last thing that we estimated was something else that we found in our analysis of the mortgage data. I'm sure you're going to be shocked and surprised to learn that white borrowers in Boston received much lower interest rates than Black and brown borrowers did. And by the way, this is true across incomes. The details in the charts are in our reports. They're kind of complicated, so they don't really fit on the screen here. But one of the things that is important to note is that just like with mortgage denials, low-income white borrowers, we found, receive more favorable rates than higher income Black and Latinx borrowers. Anywhere from 0.25 to 0.35 points higher for Black and Latinx home borrowers, which over the course of a 30-year mortgage can amount to quite a difference in what you end up paying to the bank. So again, we asked, what if Black and brown borrowers paid the same interest rates as white borrowers within each income level? We didn't even try to make it equitable across class. We just said within each income level, how much wealth would have been gained if they had paid equitable interest rates over the life of a 30-year mortgage, using standard assumptions and conservative assumptions, and the details again are in the reports. We found that for Black borrowers, that would have been anywhere between $50,000 to $250,000. For Latinx borrowers, $31,000 to $165,000. And what I'd just like to point out, for those of you who are like, that's not a lot of money, I can tell you, this for myself, if I had an aunt who gifted me what was left in her savings account before her death, and it was $31,000, I would find something to do with that money. I do think it's important as we land the plane to be a little bit transparent. These economic impacts are very conservative. They're at the individual household level, and they're very conservative. We have conservative and then even more conservative estimates. So we are very confident in our results. And we also know that the true loss of wealth, even at the individual level, is much greater than this. Which gets us to, what do we do about this? We believe that the best time to act on white supremacist racism institutionalized in law, policy, and practice was 50 years ago. The next best time is now. HFE is one of the many ways that we can make this happen. So I want to thank you for your time, and I'm going to pass this back to Maria.
Thank you, Neenah. What a wealth of data. Yeah, many emotions are stirred up in me listening to you once again, although I've read it and heard it before. So I just want to kind of close the loop on Homes for Equity and our research. Our legal analysis concluded that race-conscious buyer selection may be upheld by the courts if we could show that significant racial disparities and a history of discrimination exist and still exists. We believe that the research that Neenah just shared with us proves that, in fact, there was a significant amount of race-based housing discrimination, and that, in fact, it continues to this day at all levels within the system. We use that research that you just heard about to design a narrowly tailored program to address this problem. And again, our goal is for Homes for Equity units to be sold to Black people who have experienced the continuing harms associated with housing discrimination, and for them to benefit and to be able to put that small dent to close the racial wealth gap. These folks have shouldered the burden of these discriminatory practices, and we believe that our research substantiates that, in fact, it exists and it continues to exist. So thank you for listening. I'll turn it back over to Whitney.
Thank you, Maria. As you said, a real wealth of data and a real appreciation for your work. And thank you for those presentations. I want to ground us. I know many of folks in the chat are digesting some of this. They've been messaging me like, what was that data point again? And just really in awe about some of the work that you guys have been able to do, and thank you. I'll start off with you, Dr. Neenah. I want to jump right in. I have a question. Well, you didn't talk too much and spend time with the methodology. I did have a question about the HMDA data, right? So we know that increasing number of folks of color are obtaining mortgages, right? Via mortgage companies who are not required to report HMDA data. What do you see as sort of those disparities, right? So documenting disparities going forward, what might be the remedy to this issue, right? Because I think the data you were able to collect on this is so important. What are some of the ramifications of that in this work?
Yeah, that was, so we started to see these gaps in the HMDA data, particularly from 2020 to 2022, because that was the time period that we could start to drill down for Afro-Latinx buyers. But prior to that, well, it's actually more complicated. HMDA data is a super complex data set. And so when we started to see these gaps, and we were really curious about it. And when we looked into it, we discovered that it's mainly, so there's a lot of mortgage company or companies that give mortgages, that provide mortgages that do not have to report to HMDA. But what we seem to be seeing is that these internet mortgage companies are the ones where they don't have those mortgage requirements, and they are an increasingly larger part of the mortgage market. So they don't have the same reporting requirements as banks and standard mortgage companies do. Now, what's important about this is that the internet mortgage companies appear to be increasingly used by people of color to get mortgages, since they're not getting them from the banks, from regular banks. They seem to be able to be, and maybe it's marketing, who knows, but they are more and more people of color are using these internet mortgage companies who are not required to report to the level that standard banks and standard mortgage companies do. So ultimately what this means is we're going to have a much more difficult time in the future monitoring racial discrimination in the home buyer process, because we will have less and less data on the folks who experience the most discrimination. So, the remedy to that is basically to make everybody report. Everybody needs to be reporting mortgages, period. Well, I can hear all the excuses about reporting and burden and blah, blah, blah. But, we have a duty to redress racial discrimination in this country. And so burden, if you have enough capital to lend money, you have enough to report on it. So that, to me, that's the basic remedy. The other really quick thing that I would like to also point out for those of us who are very concerned with the Afro-Latinx community in particular, they're a very small part of the data set right now for Boston. We only had 2 years of data of the Afro-Latinx buying experience over time, which means that we're sort of like, well, what we see is a little bit not quite as solid as we'd like to see it. I think over time, we're going to have a better idea over the specific experience of our Afro-Latina neighbors.
We have work to do, right? We have work to do. Maria, let me come over to you. I have a question really in light of sort of given the political environment and cultural and legal environment, right? Especially with legal cases before the Supreme Court around higher education, right? Affirmative action. How are you approaching sort of redress in this context? I think folks are really leaning into and wondering what's going to happen and what ramifications will come from that in your work.
Yeah. Thank you, Whitney, for that question. So we know that the current political, cultural, social environment may be challenging for us. We started Homes for Equity kind of thinking that we may be legally challenged, specifically around the race-conscious marketing of the homes. So our legal analysis concluded that the Fair Housing Act obligates the redress. And so we narrowly tailored our program. So we have documented eligibility requirements for Homes for Equity, very narrowly tailored, leveraging the research that Dr. Neenah just shared with us. So we believe that we have a strong case in the event of a legal challenge. And we're out there right now, through this forum and others, building the public case for it, right? And so with the support and advocacy of, we met with elected officials, we're in very active conversations with the city about the deed restrictions and potential changes to that. But we believe that with public support and advocacy in every aspect of it, that, we have a chance. And you know what? We have to do it. It's just from our moral center, we have to do it. We have to see where we end up. It's going to be a pilot and it's going to be challenging, but for us, it's not an option to say it's hard. We can do hard stuff.
We can do hard stuff, leaning into that and figuring out how to get it right. How can people get engaged? Well, I know you shared some of the next steps. I want to give you some opportunity to talk about that. Could be here with you guys all day.
Yeah.
Keep us on target with the program but how can people get engaged?
Yeah, so people can get engaged. I'm going to put into the chat we have a petition on change.org. We would encourage folks to go out and to sign on to our petition. People can look at our research. We've started a public campaign to sharing the research and getting advocacy. People can can talk with us. We're working with our New Esther's community engagement folks. We're going out in the community at every level. We will talk to any group, any size. Like I said, we're talking to all of those constituencies to raise the awareness of what the data is showing us and the need to take action. Because if we sit here, we are going to be in the same position 50 years. And Dr. T talked about how this is so meaningful for the next generation, whether you have children or not. You know, that next generation is going to continue to feel the impact of this unless we do something. And it's going to, again, it's going to be a challenge. It's going to be hard, but, you know, I'm in it for the long run.
Thank you so much. Dr. Neenah, any final thoughts as we wrap our conversation here? You're muted.
Muted because I'm thinking. No, I think I would only say that I know there's some folks here who are not, they would argue that, hey, you know, homeownership isn't the only way to reduce the racial wealth gap. And we all acknowledge that. However, has been for decades and will continue to be for a long time, one of the major ways that's most accessible for most people. We did see in our research, you know, all of this is tied to all the other forms of our racial wealth gaps, right? So it's also tied to education, it's tied to ability to entrepreneurship and ability to start businesses and sustain businesses, small businesses, large businesses. So 8 homes for equity nobody here is saying, oh, this is the only way to do it. We need all the tools. We need all the tools. And so that's one of the other things that we want to leave people with is that we need the policy tools and we need all the multiple kinds of tools to address and redress this discrimination.
Thank you so much, Dr. Neenah, Maria. I'm in awe. We have work to do. The issue was multi-pronged, how we got here. The solutions must be multi-pronged as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us. Thank you for listening.